get myself set up here. I notice that we have a few visitors here this morning, and I think you should know that I'm not the normal preacher. In fact, a lot of our members would say I'm not normal at all. My dad's a normal preacher. His name is Skip, and he's away on a little vacation with a few other family members, so I'm filling in for him today. I'm not quite as practiced or polished as he is, but I will do my best for you. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I seem to be obsessed with the subject of choice or free will. It comes up often and in various ways in my lessons. For whatever reason, God has given me a slightly different view of the world and of life. I see details that the average person doesn't seem to see. I also see choices that others seem to be oblivious to. At least that's from my perspective. When there's a difficult choice to make, most people seem to see maybe 3 or 4 choices. In the same situation, I might see 7 or 8, or maybe several variations of those same 3 or 4 choices that someone else does. This can be a curse, but it can also be a blessing. It gives me more freedom and flexibility in life, but it can also be overwhelming and confusing. There is something that has made decision-making a lot easier for me in recent years, and I'll be getting to that in a few minutes. There seems to be a large number of people in the world who are confused and uncertain of what to do in life, and whether or not they're doing the right thing. I think that this has increased greatly in recent years, and I think it's because we've lost our moral compass and respect for authority. In many cases, we simply don't have any good examples of authority to respect. There are a few areas where we are more confused than in religion. One day, when I got on the Yellow Pages website and I looked up churches in liberal Kansas, I found over 50 listings for this fairly small town. Quick question. How many gods are there? I think that most religious people in this country would agree that there is one God, but they disagree about who he is and how to worship him. Are we confused about religion? Going by the evidence we all can see, the answer would be a loud and resounding yes, we are. So my question is, how do we make decisions, especially of a religious or spiritual nature? Before I get into that, I have another question to ask first. Why don't people use the same logic and reasoning for religion as they do for everyday life? I've known perfectly logical, sensible, respectable people who I can trust to get good advice about everyday life from. But when it comes to the subject of religion, they kind of get really weird. I've heard many people say things like, I believe it in my heart, or I just don't feel like God would do that. Really? You're going to bet your soul on a feeling? Do you make important life decisions this way? Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12 says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Isn't that another way of saying that it feels right, but it's really not? A few years ago, when I was working at a car dealership and wanted to buy a vehicle myself, I had a choice to make. I could buy the 2002 GMC Envoy that I ended up buying, or I could buy a brand new Chevy Silverado. In my heart, I felt like I should get the Silverado, but in my bank account, not a chance. Guess which choice I made? That's right, I made the smart one, the one based on the facts. Here's another good example of emotional-based choices gone wrong. How many of us, especially those who are a little bit older, have looked back on our past romantic relationships and said things like, what was I thinking? Or I should have known better. The problem is that you probably weren't really thinking, and I've been there myself. You were enjoying the momentary feeling so much that you ignored the facts of the relationship. It's called rose-colored glasses. Now, I don't know about you, but I've done a lot of studying, self-examination on this subject, and my faith is based on things like knowledge, wisdom, experience, logic, reasoning, and evidence. Yes, we should have things like joy and hope, but those things should be based on something more solid than that. Emotion should be a result of the truth and not take the place of it. Emotion should be a response, not a foundation. Now let's look at some examples of this in everyday life. When I want to make a decision about something, I want information. One of my favorite words is research. Just ask my wife. I suppose this began with my grandmother on my mother's side. You see, my grandparents had something in their house that some of you may have never seen. You could call it Google's great-grandfather. It was a large set of books that all had the same cover. It was called the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, many times when I had questions about the world we live in, my grandmother would say, "Look it up." At the time, it kind of frustrated me, but now I see why she did it. One reason was that she was trying to teach me to look for the answers myself instead of listening to someone else's version of things. Another benefit is that even if she knew the answer, she might have gotten something wrong or forgotten some details she told me herself. If I read it for myself, I couldn't blame her for getting something wrong. Now this leads me to a very important part of this lesson. What was the Encyclopedia Britannica to me back then? It was the authority for the information it covered. It was a trusted, impartial source of information. If my sister and I disagreed about something, the encyclopedia would settle it. You couldn't argue with the encyclopedia. What about other authorities? Say you're playing Scrabble or some other word game and someone argues with you about the word they're trying to play, or you're trying to play. Go to the dictionary. If I'm trying to drive to a place I've never been before, Google Maps will tell me how to get there. At least I hope. Now some of you can see this coming. The next obvious question is there an authoritative source of information on spiritual matters? But before I get into that, I want to do something. What do you think would happen if I let go of this Bible right now? Do you want to know what's so great about that visual is? I don't even have to do it. Every single one of the adults and most of the kids in here had the very same thought. It's going to hit the desk with a bang. Gravity, it's the law. I can drop this Bible 1,000 times and it will fall every time. It's reliable, it's predictable, it's unavoidable. Laws like gravity exist all over the place. The universe is full of what you might call order, structure, laws, or rules. Do you know that the same person who made all of this reliable and predictable order in the physical world also made heaven, hell, and the rules and laws that govern spiritual things? Now, my next question is very important. Does it make any sense for us to believe that this same person, who apparently likes order and structure, would make the spiritual realm any less structured? Speaking of gravity, how does your gravity work? Does yours let you bounce around like you were on the moon and pick up cars with your bare hands? Neither does mine. Gravity works the same way for every single one of us, regardless of what we believe or feel about it. Wouldn't spiritual laws made by the same person who made gravity be the same way? Do I determine how gravity affects me? Does my opinion mean anything when it comes to gravity? Then what gives me or anyone else the right to determine how we should worship the God who made the universe? Wouldn't he decide that for us? Here's a fact that I really don't think most people understand well enough. Truth is not subjective. What I mean by that is what is true for everyone universally and is not affected by or changed by what any of us thinks or feels about it. This is true for physical things and spiritual things. We don't each create our own spiritual reality by simply believing something to be so. This is not a fairy tale. Keeping this in mind, we should want to seek out what the truth actually is. Now, let's talk about logic for a minute. I'm going to borrow an illustration that Dad used years ago. Now, if I were to hold this Bible up to a group of classmates, let's consider that you're a class right now, and ask each one of you, just from sitting where you are, to write down how thick you think this Bible is. And I collected all those answers. What do you think would happen? What do you think the results would be? More than likely, I would get a range of answers. Some people might say an inch and a quarter, inch and a half, something like that. Depending on if you were an engineering kind of person or a mechanic, you might get a little bit closer to the real answer. But how do I determine the real, actual truth? If I counted all the responses up and found the measurement with the most votes, would that be the right answer? How many religions are based on that method today? Or maybe I'll just pick the answer from whoever I think is the smartest person in the room. Does that work? How about the one who is most passionate about their answer? They must be right? How about the answer from the most popular person in the room, or whoever is most likable or has the best speaking voice? Now, I hope you can see how ridiculous this is, but unfortunately, many in the religious world use the same kind of flawed reasoning to decide what they must do to get into heaven. Now, using this scenario, I have a few logical questions to ask. When the answers vary, Can every person in the class be right? Simple logic says no. Can they all be wrong? Of course they can. Can more than one be right? Yes, but they must meet one condition. They must all have the same answer. So how do we figure out how thick this Bible actually is? Well, we use a standard, an authority, like I mentioned earlier, that no one else can argue with, like a ruler, and we measure. There is one thing, if there is one thing I want you to get out of this entire lesson, it is this. This is the ruler. This is the map and the compass. This is the authority. Am I being clear enough? I hope I am. Now I'm going to stop here for just a moment and speak to those who've been Christians a long time and have a knowledge of the Word already. Many of the scriptures that I'm going to use here in a minute are often repeated here, and it's not my desire to bore anyone. Part of my whole view on this is that one of our primary jobs or tasks is to preach and teach to those who aren't Christians. But in this time, where so few know much about the scriptures, you often have to start somewhere else and lead them to the Bible. You have to set a foundation, till the ground, as it were, just to get them to look at the Bible at all. Please keep that in mind as we return to the lesson. One of the hardest realities to really accept, especially when you've gone from one denomination to another growing up as I have, is that the truth doesn't come from man, any man, with the exception of the one and only man, the only man who has ever been both man and God, and that is Jesus himself. As Jeremiah 10:23 puts it, "O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his own steps." Now here he uses the word man to represent all mankind. Is that confusing in any way? The truth, the whole truth, has always come from God. Even Paul, who seemed to be one of the hardest working apostles, said in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, "Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ." Now, if he had said, "Imitate me," and left it at that, the message would be very different. He did what every faithful servant of God does. He pointed the way to Jesus and gave him the glory and the authority. Now, I want you to understand something here. God created the world along with everything else. Some people try to separate things that should not be separated, at least not yet. His word was designed to help us through this life. It is not separate.